want to talk today about understanding point of view or deep point of view, whether you're writing it in first person or third person, whether you're writing in writing nonfiction or fiction, and because it goes across the board. The point of writing in deep point of view, whether that's third person or first person, I tend to say deep first person or deep third person, but it goes either way. Is it allows your reader to feel as if they have become a part of whatever it is that you are writing. So again, we tend to think of deep point of view as something that only fiction writers have to think about or deal with or learn, and that's not true. If you're writing nonfiction, you want to draw your readers into whatever it is that you're talking to them about. You want them to feel as if they've experienced whatever it is that you've experienced, so much so that you want to write about this topic. So let me just give you some examples. I know that most of you are familiar with Rick Bragg, right? Everybody familiar with Rick Bragg. He is a great Southern author. He always has an article at the very back of Southern Living magazine. Just a few years back, he won the Pat Conroy Award, and he wrote one of my favorite books of all time, which is called All Over But the Shoutin', which is a nonfiction book about his family life and how that family life led him to winning a Pulitzer Prize as a journalist. So one of the things, though, that captured me about this book is that from the very first page, Rick draws the reader in with sight and sound and smell and just, I mean, almost even taste, because he talks about redbirds fighting and fighting to the point of blood. And it gets to this place of you almost can taste that metallicness of blood in your mouth and smell it even through your nose. I mean, it's just, it becomes so real. And the dirt roads and the way people speak, and just like the old man leaning over the open hood of the truck, and he's working on the truck, but he stops, to watch these redbirds fighting. You feel like you're there. Max Lucado is another who writes nonfiction that we're all familiar with. And again, from page one, you open up and you just feel like whatever it is that he's writing about, you've become a part of it. Robert Benson, another one of my favorite authors of all time, writes nonfiction, and yet the way he writes, he draws readers into his setting, his topic, even by the choices that he makes when it comes to word choices that lend itself or themselves to how, like to sight and sound and smell and taste and touch. So, of course, fiction writers know that this is what you have to do. Fiction writers have always understood that you want to bring the reader into the character's world. But I think nonfiction writers for a long time, they just wanted to state the facts. And yet, once we started seeing what we call creative nonfiction coming into play, and that is using the techniques of fiction for nonfiction, it became more readable. It became more enjoyable. For such a long time, I would say I never can finish a nonfiction book. And I think it's because, well, other than the Bible, and I think it's because it fell flat. It became scholastic to me. It became like, here are the facts, ma'am, and not actually drawing me in and allowing me to be a part of whatever it is that the writer was writing about. And once people started talking about creative nonfiction, that stopped. So years ago, many years ago, before the term deep point of view was ever said, my editors that I worked with would say to me, you have this uncanny way of drawing a reader in, and I'm not really sure how you're doing it. And I would think, well, I don't even know how I'm doing it. To be honest with you, I'm just writing. I'm just, just whatever was in my head, I was putting it on paper. And I was predominantly a fiction writer. Now, I will tell you, because I spoke about Barbara just a moment ago, that when I when I wrote my first novel, which was 1997, it took me a year from 1997 to 1998. I didn't know anything about publishing. I didn't know anything about the publishing world. I just knew I had a story to tell, and I started telling it. Started writing it down, typing it into my big computer in those days, my big PC, and then got about probably 8, 9 chapters in and thought, I have no clue what I'm doing. I just know that I love to read, and every time I would read a work of fiction, I would think, I think I could have written that. I think I understand the dynamics, but then realizing as I was doing it that I didn't understand the dynamics. So I went and got a book called, the title of it was Writing the Blockbuster Novel by Albert Zuckerman. Albert Zuckerman is a New York City agent. He's a big time, and everybody knows who he is. It was a big book, and I studied this book to the nth degree. I even bought it on tape. I don't remember how I think it was like you bought it and it was like on cassettes. I mean, this is how far back this was. And I would put it in my car and listen to it, and I would listen to it at home, and I would just take notes and take notes. And then I went back to writing, and I finished. But because no one was buying fiction back then, I got an agent, and just simply no one was buying fiction. But I had this idea for a nonfiction book, and I want to tell you how that came about so that it makes sense of how these two things tie together. My daughter and I were coming out of church one night on a Wednesday night youth group and Wednesday night Bible study, and we were coming out of the church, and a young friend of mine came running toward me, extending her left hand, going, and I knew exactly what she was showing me. She had gotten engaged, and I said, well, tell me how he proposed. And she told me this story. So when we got in the car, my daughter said, well, how did Daddy propose to you? And I said, well, you don't know that story? And she said, well, I wasn't there. And I said, well, I mean, I never told you that story. And she said, no. And I said, well, actually, I proposed to your father. And she goes, oh. And I said 6 times before he said yes. so, so I realized we tell that story almost every day from the time we get engaged to the day we get married. And then we stop telling it. And yet it is significantly one of the most romantic stories that we have. And so when my agent said to me, it's just hard to sell fiction right now. I mean, we've got Jerry B. Jenkins and Tim LaHaye, and we had a little bit of Francine Rivers, and we had Jeanette Oak, and that's just about where it ended. There were a few people like James Scott Bell who were just starting to come in, on the scene, and Angie Hunt, and a few others like that, Dee Henderson, but I mean, barely. I mean, they were barely scratching the surface at that point. He said, so do you have any ideas for a nonfiction book? And I said, yeah, actually, I do. What if we collected stories of marriage proposals, some from famous people, some from not so famous people, and put them together as a collection and weave in sonnets and scriptures and little known facts and, just trivia. And what I'd like to do, though, is weave in that the greatest proposal ever spoken was from the cross, because that was when our bridegroom was offering the mohar, which, if you know Hebrew, that's the bride price. And he thought that was a great idea. So I worked up a proposal, and I presented it at a CBA International Convention, sat down with a young woman at Barber, and I just said, quick, tell me how your parents got engaged. And she said, I don't know. And I said, why do we tell that story every day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I found out that she had literally just gotten married 2 weeks earlier. 9 days later, they offered me a contract. So I had a nonfiction book that came out that was filled with stories. And then I followed that up with a follow-up book, which was called One True Vow. And this was, I went back to some of those same couples and said, now tell me what happened when the vows were tested. And they shared some of their stories with me. And of course, some of them had loved unto death. And those were really, really touching. So what I wanted to do with that was just to encourage people that even when the hardships come, try to hold on as best you can. But it was all story, yet it was true story. And I wrote it in such a way as to make the reader feel, or allow the reader to feel, as if they were experiencing that story with the couple. So again, I had to look at it after I heard from several editors saying, I don't know how you're doing this. And I said, I don't know how I'm doing it either. And I began to look at my own work to see, how have I done this? And I realized it went back to the five senses, because I taught myself to write fiction by watching movies and stopping and starting at each scene and asking myself, what was the dialogue? What did you hear? What did you hear outside of the dialogue? What did you see? What did you, like, not literally see, but you kind of knew was off camera? If there was a scene where you could taste something. I mean, how many of you ever watched, like, I love to watch these British shows, and every time they have a spot of tea, I have to have tea too. I have to stop it and go make my tea, because now I'm tasting the tea. I want the tea. Or, like I remember not too long ago, I was watching an old My Three Sons. I'll be honest, I love the old shows. And they were eating pancakes, and my husband walked in, and my husband's the cook in our family. And he said, what would you like for dinner tonight? And I said, pancakes. Why? Because I had seen it. I could taste it. I could smell the syrup. So this is how I taught myself to write fiction. And I realized that's what it was all along. It was getting in touch with the senses inside of every scene in fiction and every section of nonfiction. So let's start with the sense that we use the most, and that is, of course, sight. Now, here's what you want to be careful of, because new writers will often fall to something like she saw, or she noticed, or he recognized, or he watched. That's telling. That's not showing. What you want to do as a writer is crawl into the skin of your character, or if you're writing nonfiction, crawl into your own skin and relive whatever it is that you are trying to relay, because we relay truth with story. That's exactly what Jesus did. You relay truth with story. Think about when your pastor gets up on Sunday mornings or Saturday or whenever it is that you go to church, and he typically will start with a story, will he not? Because it draws people in. He may start with a joke, but that's kind of a story. But whatever, he doesn't just jump right in. If he does, you lose people. You easily lose people with that. So you start with that story. So either you're going to get into the character that you are writing about, or you're going to get back into your own self and think, what did I see? But don't tell me what you saw. Show me what you saw. So here's some examples. She recognized the woman as being Jennifer Miller. Now that's a tell, but let's show it instead. Jennifer Miller, sure as she was Allison McCoy, the woman standing on the other side of the room was Jennifer Miller. Okay, now I know how she feels about Jennifer Miller. I've got this little sense of how she feels about her. The second most used sense is, of course, hearing. So you want to look for words such as heard or the sound of, etc., and then delete those words. You don't want to tell me what he heard or tell me what the sound was of, but instead allow me to experience that sound. For example, when I was a journalist in Israel, and I was writing about En Gedi. En Gedi is a place in the desert where David and his 400 ragtag men hid for a long time. They hid within the caves. There are three waterfalls as you look up the canyon. There are three waterfalls. One is kind of a little squatty one. One is a little bigger, and it's not as high as the highest one. They call it lower waterfall David, and then the mid waterfall David, and then upper waterfall David. But the one in the middle is kind of thick and fat, and it rushes out of this cavern, this cave. But when you go up to the upper waterfall, David, it is a thin waterfall, and it comes from way up high. And what I wrote in my journal was it sounded like the army, the marching army of 1,000 men. And I thought about how that kind of tied in with David. This is where David was when Saul came in to relieve himself, and they were in one of the caves. So I thought about what that might have sounded like, that whole experience. And I tied those two things together. That's nonfiction. But just to say, the water was hitting the rocks, or I heard water hitting the rocks, doesn't carry quite the same punch as that the water fell with the footsteps of 1,000 marching men. And I think that's the way I wrote it. Okay, so you want to be careful of things like he heard a tree limb break behind the house. Don't tell me, show me. And it's so simple to do. A tree limb broke behind the house. That's it. Just take away the he heard, and you've got your sentence correct. Because most of us know what a tree limb sounds like. Now, you can actually, build on that. That's just a real simple way. So here we go again. He heard the sound of a tree limb breaking behind the house. Let's go just a little bit deeper with that. Behind the house, a tree limb broke, the cracking penetrating to where he waited several feet away. Okay, now you've got that cracking sound. And you might even in your own mind hear that thump when it hits the ground, that thud. Okay, so the third most important sense is smell. And it's a very important sense because you and we all know that you can head toward a restaurant and say, I'm not really hungry. But as soon as you smell the food, you're suddenly ravenous. You're like, I'm starving to death now. I've got to have something to eat. Right? My husband and I went to Outback yesterday, and all the way there, I said, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm not really that hungry. And then we got there, we got out, and I smelled the sizzling steak, and I'm like, I'm starving to death. So I got myself a steak. So be careful of any words that would detect smelling, such as she smelled. She smelled cinnamon in the coffee. Here's another way to write that. She brought the coffee mug toward her ready lips, the sweet scent of cinnamon greeting her like a good morning kiss. Now that tells me how she feels about cinnamon. She likes it. If I did not want my character or myself to like that smell of cinnamon, then I would write that a completely different way. The fourth one is taste. This is the fourth most important that we have to consider. And you want to look for words such as taste and tasted. She tasted this, he tasted that. An example, he tasted peanut butter. Now, again, depending on how he feels about peanut butter is how you're going to write this. He took the first bite, allowed it to play on his tongue before swallowing. Great day in the morning, his favorite peanut butter. Or he took the first bite, and as soon as he swallowed, his throat began to tickle and swell. Oh no, peanut butter. So now we know where he stands on peanut butter. And of course, finally, we have touch. And you want to look for words such as felt or touch. These are the words, when I say you want to look for these words, these are the words you want to edit out of your first draft, second draft, third draft. Hopefully you've got them all out by then. She touched the soft leather with her fingers. Rewrite that. She slid her fingertips along the leather, soft and inviting, closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Sweet mercy. So, there is a smell with leather. And so that's why I wrote here that she inhaled deeply. I don't have to tell the reader so much what that smells like, unless, of course, she's a detective and this is a clue or something, like she felt it and she smelled blood on the leather or something like that. but just that scent of real leather, it has a wonderful aroma to it. Now, also, when you're writing, you want to think of the differences. So, there's a difference in this smell and that smell, but they may be closely related. Or this touch and that touch, although they may be closely related. So think of the difference. And because you're Southerners, you're going to understand. Think of the difference in getting in a car with leather seats in the summer versus the winter months. If it's been in the hot sun, then it is hot. And when you open that car door, there's going to be that whoosh of hot air that's going to come out. If you're wearing sunglasses or glasses, they're going to fog up. You want to stop long enough to take all of these things into consideration. You're going to not be able to sit down right away. So there's going to be some adjustments there. You might even have to like hold yourself up just a little bit and start your car and get that air on really quick. But if you're getting into a car that's been in the parking lot all day and it's hardly reached 32 degrees, it's a little bit different. It's like even with clothes and a coat, the chill just goes up into your bones. One of the things when I'm working with my coaching clients that I say a lot, is slow down. Slow this character down. Slow yourself down. When you were experiencing this and now you're writing about it in nonfiction, what were you seeing? What were you smelling? What were you hearing? What were you tasting? What were you touching? Slow it down. Not all five senses are going to be appropriate for that particular paragraph or scene or section of your work, but just slow down enough that you allow your reader to experience whatever it is that you want them to experience. Now, out of those five emotions, when you do that, you bring in the sixth emotion. The sixth sense, and that is emotion. I'm sorry, let me go back and say that again because I just totally messed it up. Out of those five senses, you will then bring about the sixth sense, which is emotion. That allows, again, your reader to experience what it is that you want them to experience. People don't read because they don't want to be entertained or they don't want to learn something. That's why they read. They read for that great escape. If you read fiction, that's typically that great escape moment. But you also want to be entertained with conflict and resolution, etc. And in nonfiction, we read because we want to learn something about that particular subject, no matter what it is that you write about. Whether you write travel logs or you write blog posts or you write Sunday school papers or you write just, nonfiction books about specific topics, whether that's evangelical topics, prayer, getting through a tough season in your life, then how you got through it and that kind of thing, which will kind of like border on memoir or a little bit of biography. You want the reader to experience it with you. You want them to say, this carried me somewhere and spoke to me and meant something to me. This is why, like, for example, with Robert Benson, I own every book that Robert Benson has ever written because he takes me to myself. He makes me get down into the core of my own walk with Christ. And when I am at that place, I feel something new and I feel something different and I want to go deeper with him. I don't want to just be on the surface with him. I remember after reading a particular book of his, I said, I don't want to get to heaven and have to ask someone, which one is Jesus? I want to know him. I want to know him here and I want to know him now so that I don't have to ask when I get to heaven. I want to know that I know him first and foremost as I walk through the pearly gates, to be figurative. Okay, so look for words as you are editing, such as thought, knew, wondered, realized, remembered, decided, wished for, or any variation of those words. Because when you start writing in those words, you're telling your reader and you're not allowing your reader to experience it. So I'm going to say those words again in case you want to write those down. Look for words such as thought, knew, wondered, realized, remembered, decided, wished, or any variation of those words, such as wondering, realizing, remembering, deciding, wishing, those kinds of things. Let me give you an example. 3 years had passed, but he remembered the day his wife died as if it were yesterday. Now, this doesn't tell me how he feels about the fact that his wife died 3 years ago. If I rewrite it like this, it does. 3 years had passed since his wife left him, dying in his arms as he begged her to stay. 3 years, or had it only been a day? Now, that could be fiction or nonfiction. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. In fiction or nonfiction, you will hook your reader with story, but stories are not to be told as much as shown, because when they're shown, they are experienced. Remember, however, that everything must be in moderation. You can't show every little thing. If you do that, you've got War and Peace. you've got a thick novel that you're never going to be able to sell. So you have to balance, narration and dialogue. You have to balance showing and telling. And that becomes when you put all that together, that becomes, it becomes the sweet. It becomes the sweet spot of what readers want from their authors. Look at some of your own work and begin to search for those telling words and then start rewriting. When you are writing, I'm sorry, I kind of lost my place in my notes. And part of that is because if I put my glasses on, I can't read it. And with it off, I can't read it. So, because I've just got it at this not a good place. Okay. So look at some of your own work and look for those telling words. But this is really what you do in the process of editing and not so much writing at first. Once you become adept at editing in this way, where you're looking for those tell words, you will discover that even as you are writing, you are editing in your head. So like you will like start to write something and you will write, he remembered or I remembered, and you go, no, that's not what I want to do. And you will back up very quickly. It just becomes second nature after a while. But initially, you have to train yourself in this. So if you are writing fiction, remember, you must crawl into the character's skin. And if you are not writing fiction, if you're writing nonfiction, you got to crawl back into your own experiences. You want to write in such a way that if your character or you stepped on a piece of glass with a bare foot and cut the ball of your foot, your reader will go, they will feel it. I mean, you probably have experienced reading something that either you're smiling or laughing or frowning or crying, or if it's tense, if there's a lot of tension, if it's suspense and mystery and that kind of thing, your shoulders start to go up and you have to, okay, relax. All of a sudden your whole body is tense. That is the way you want to write. Remember that you are the characters and the character is you, or get into your own skin first. Okay. Remember too, that if you're writing in first person, and for nonfiction, that's typically the way, or if you're writing fiction, you can write in first or third. You can only see or hear or taste or smell or touch what the character or you is sensing at that time. You cannot pull in everybody else's experiences. If you're writing fiction, you determine whose scene it's going to be by which character has the most at stake. If you're writing nonfiction, you're typically talking about yourself or your own experiences, or maybe someone that you've met along the way and you're writing out of their experiences, but you can't start pulling in from all these different points of view. You want to stick with one because that's the way we relate. Okay. Another thing to look for is to eliminate those emotion words like she was sad, or she was afraid, or he was angry, etc. What does that look like, or what does that sound like? I understand when someone is angry if they pick up something and throw it at someone else, or if they stomp, or if they scream, or if they start beating their fist against something. That shows me someone is angry. It's so much more effective than just telling me she was angry. Because what level of anger is she at? I mean, I've been so mad I've had to walk off, but, that's going to be one way of showing it. Her face turned red and she turned and walked off. Okay. Versus she picked up something and threw it. Now I know where her anger is, and I know what kind of person she is as well. So here's an example. I was as angry as I was confused. That's not what you want to write. How about this? Life pulled me into a vortex, drew me with such speed and power, I felt like Alice falling through the rabbit hole. Wesley's face grew fuzzy. Time slowed and sped up at the same time. His words garbled like Charlie Brown's teacher when she spoke from the head of the classroom. Womp womp, womp womp, or a record playing at the wrong speed. It's the same thing, but it's much more descriptive. Now look at this editing process. This is telling. She saw the car speeding toward her. This is showing. The car's engine revved. The sun's light a glint on the hood as it careened toward her. This is even better. This is like second, third, editing process. The car's engine revved. The sun's light a glint on the hood as it careened toward her. Her mouth formed a silent O as adrenaline pulsed through every artery, every vein. There was nowhere to turn, to the left or to the right. It didn't matter. The car would follow with a flick of the wheel. The only thing to do was pray the pain of the impact would be but a moment, and that for her, death's door would swing wide open. Here's another tell. He was nervous. Here's a show. He tapped his fingers on the tabletop. Even better. Mason fiddled with the 4x4 piece of paper with the woman's phone number scribbled upon it. He placed it on the desktop, straightened it just so, drummed his fingers to the tune of "The Lady is a Tramp." Finally, with a deep intake and exhale of breath, he picked up the phone's handset. He returned it, wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow, picked up the handset again. My gosh, what kind of spell had this woman cast on him? Now, here's something I want to make a note of right here. The old way of internal thought, which was to put it in italics and then shift it from third person to first person, is considered passé. So you don't want to do that anymore if you're writing fiction. These are all easy to rewrite. And anytime you read them, to look at them and say, okay, that's a tell, and then to rewrite them. But to go deeper is going to take some skill on your part. It's also going to take some time on your part. Give yourself that time. Give yourself that ability, that skill, because what we have here as writers is something that we sharpen. We don't just come into it naturally. We've worked it and we've worked it and we've worked it.